Welcome to 6 African Trade Talks. In this episode, our guest is Fortune Gamaya. Fortune is the founder of Luminary Advisory and Consulting. Fortune, welcome to 6 African Trade Talks. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Chad. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Before we start our show, we'd like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can with Optimum African Experience Cape Town Leisure Experience with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
Fortune, you have had such a lucrative career for the last 15 years, having worked across multiple organizations. Walk through your career journey and how it has evolved over time.
Thank you, Chad. So I started my career in the automotive sector, working for a company called Toyota Tsusho Africa. And I was part of the team that set up the first organizational development unit within that business. It's now called CIFAO. And I was called a value creator. What it is, it's an organizational development specialist responsible for leadership development. And it was because we had acquired distributors from another organization, and we really wanted to inculcate the Toyota way of doing things, or the Toyota culture. And so I was responsible for Malawi and Zambia. So I worked with the leadership team to help them cascade their strategic objectives throughout the rest of the business, but also deliver a leadership development program that was part of a cultural transformation. And fast forward a few years later, I then also became responsible for rolling out the Toyota way in our Kenyan distributors and in our Uganda distributor. So that's when I was at Toyota. And when I left Toyota, I was now based in Durban. And I was responsible for leadership development, performance management, and cascading of the strategic objectives for our South African support operations based in Durban. After that, I always say, in your career, you always have to have somebody who can sponsor you, who can advocate for you. I resigned in 2009. But believe it or not, when I submitted my resignation to my GM at the time, she was kind enough to speak to our MD, and they said there's absolutely no need for you to resign. So I started remote work in 2009 because they allowed me to come and work from my home here in Cape Town. So I worked from home for a year, and the idea was that we were going to start offering our organizational development services in Cape Town. And I started engaging with organizations like Media 24, UCT, and I really started building a network here in Cape Town. And then in 2010, we then decided to go our separate ways. I left Toyota, but then what was interesting is I continued to consult for them throughout all of 2011. And during that time, I also then introduced to the University of Cape Town at the Graduate School of Business. And because of my Toyota Way training, I then became the program director for their Lean Leadership program. I did a few cohorts of that program. And during that time, I also started doing some work for a mining house here in South Africa. They're now called South 32, but they were called BHP Billiton at the time. And that work grew, and one project led to another. I then started doing some work based on the Lean Leadership work I was doing for the school, which is really about operations excellence or operations management. And so I started getting a lot of requests to help organizations, particularly in the retail sector. So I worked extensively with the Fortune Group and the multiple brands within that retailer and another retailer here in Cape Town. And then with that, my work just started to grow. I partnered with Duke Corporate Education, and through them, I did multiple programs here in South Africa and abroad and in the rest of Africa. That led me to start my practice. And when I started my practice, I ran for a few years, and then later I joined Deloitte, where I headed up human capital here in the Western Cape. And after 2.5 years, I then came back to my practice. So I'm back in my practice now, doing strategy formulation, leadership development, culture transformation, personal mastery, and leadership coaching.
Amazing. What a journey. You just brought back my memory about reading and learning about Toyota Way and my first encounter with Kaizen. So thank you very much for sharing your journey. You work with business leaders and partner with them in preparing their workforce for the future of work. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Chad. I think that just last night I was teaching an MBA class on the future of work. I think that we have over-conceptualized this concept of the future of work because actually we are in the future of work. What is the future of work? When we talk about that, we look at three concepts. We look at work, which is the value that your organization generates. We look at the workplace, which is the place where the value is generated, and the workforce, which is who generates the value. If we look at COVID, the pandemic, where has it disrupted us hugely for us to really get into the practice of the future of work, not concept? It's in the workplace. So before the pandemic, when we looked at the three components that I've mentioned, the constant used to be the workplace. Because if somebody thought, I'm going to Luminary or I'm going to Optimum, they would be going to the offices of Luminary or Optimum. But post-COVID, people just want to know that there's somebody that they can trust. So the workforce has become the constant and the workplace has become the variable. But what needs to stay constant is the value that you're generating and challenging yourself to ensure that that value is still relevant in the times that you're operating. So I think that it's useful for leaders to think about it using those three aspects so that when you challenge yourself about the value that you generate, you want to be looking at who am I generating this value for? And is this value still relevant? Because then you're now thinking about how do you future-proof or future-ready the value that you generate. So if the value that you generate is going to change, what are the capabilities and the skills that speaks to the workforce that you're going to require for you to continue to produce a value that is relevant? And how is the workplace going to be disrupted? So that is the work that we do with leaders to really practicalize this concept that we've been talking about called future of work, instead of leaving it out there as a concept and allowing people to continue to live under the illusion that the future of work is something that is yet to come, but actually it's something that we are faced with now.
Amazing. We can't keep talking about the future of work when we're here already. So thank you very much for sharing that. So Fortune, you have had the privilege to work with people from various cultures on the African continent, as well as in places like Europe and the Middle East. What can we as Africans learn from other continents in terms of work ethic and culture in order to compete favorably?
So can I start by the premise that after working with cultures across multiple continents, the first premise that I start with is we are all human. We all seek the same things. That's point number one. And then I think point number two, there's obviously the question around nature or nurture. So the nature is that we are all human. The nurture is that the cultures that we grow up in are very different. I always talk about the discipline of working with Japanese, because often when I teach operations management at UCT and I teach the concepts of the Toyota way, people then always argue, but how are we going to get this right? Because this comes from a Japanese culture. So the first thing is that Japanese treat their work as their offering to the universe. It's not just work. And I'm reminded of Eiji Toyoda, who was at some point the president of Toyota. He said, people give us 8 hours of their life, not of their workday, of their life. We should respect it. So that's point number one. How do we create meaningful work that people see their work as an offering to the collective? And then I think when I work in Europe, what I learned is this respect for structure and order. So when we agree we are going to do something at a particular time, can we adhere to it? Because I've had countries where I have worked and we start at 8 and the program actually starts at 11, Chad, and they will remain nameless But I think that some of those things, they speak to the discipline that is cultivated right from childhood. And then, of course, there are countries here in Africa. When I did work in Nigeria, I found that the people in Nigeria exhibit life to its fullest. So I can talk about all the different cultures, but one thing that I can say is that every culture has something to learn from another. So to talk about the point of what can we learn from an African perspective, one thing that I learned when I worked in the Middle East is that the leadership cares deeply about the quality of life that they create for their citizens. And so for me, I think that's one lesson that we can learn, not only for the country's leadership, but for everyone who is entrusted with leading a team. Start from the premise that these people are under my care. And if they're under my care, it means that their livelihood is under my care. It means that the society, the well-being of the society is under my care. So every decision that I make should be made knowing that my decisions have extensive impact in society. So that's what I would say I think is important for us to take from an African perspective. And of course, in terms of the cultural components that I spoke about from all the different regions that I've worked with, I think one other one that I would like to point out is I always say that I love India, but one of the cities that I love is New Delhi. I found whenever I'm there is they're content in their chaos. So they understand that they operate in a place that is very complex, that is very chaotic, but they have also trained their minds to be able to navigate the complexity and the chaos that comes with it. So you never actually find people in New Delhi flustered. In fact, they're the calmest. And I think from a systems thinking, we could certainly learn that from them.
Powerful. Thank you very much for sharing. You are passionate about coaching leaders to become more aware of the power they have and how they use it as they lead organizations. What common and recurring mistakes have you realized that cut across African business leaders that we can work on?
Thank you, Chad. That's a powerful question. And again, I start with the premise, we are all human. And now being all human is that we all have this thing called the ego. So I always say that it is in the acknowledgement of the ego that we can be truly liberated from it. Because no one can stand confidently and say that I don't have an ego. It's just that your ego shows up in a way that it shows up. We are all in an existential crisis. So it is about creating the awareness of how does my existential crisis, how does my ego show up? Because a few days ago, I posted on LinkedIn that one of the things that I learned from David Letterman while he was interviewing Ellen DeGeneres, he was asking a very sensitive question. And he said, I really don't want to be dumb and clumsy about this. So please bear with me because I don't know much about this subject. I think that leaders, we fall into the trap of the illusion that we have to know it all. You don't actually. And so if you leave on the premise that as a leader, you should know it all, you're always going to hire people who are less smart than you. So if you hire people who are less smarter than you, no one is going to challenge you. And so as a result, your illusion will then get reinforced. Your ego will get exacerbated. So I always speak to leaders about knowing where on the ego continuum they are, because the ego has two extremes. It's got the inferiority and the superiority. And on either extreme lies the fragility of the ego. So I always say to leaders, work towards achieving what we call interiority, leading with intention, because you're going to do less dumb and clumsy things and do less harm because you are aware of yourself and you're aware of others. And it goes back to that point that I spoke about, that you take your role as a leader, as a carer and a steward of what you are entrusted with.
That's quite interesting. Thank you very much for sharing. It also reminds me of a story about Henry Ford, where one guy came to him and he says, I can prove that you're a man of ignorance. And, he said, no, well, you can ask me any question. And he was asked a number of questions and he responded until he says, you know what, you should stop annoying me, because one thing I can tell you is I don't have to know everything, but underneath my table, I have a number of buttons which I can press, and in a few minutes, I will have information from anywhere about anything across the globe because I have the right people. So definitely, it's really powerful. Thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you.
Before we continue, we'd like to hear a word from our sponsors.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can with Optimum African Experience Cape Town Pleasure Experience, with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary, and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
So Fortune, you've traveled across Africa and you've traveled globally. What experience can you share with us now that we are in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area environment where we are focusing on creating a One Africa? Any experiences you would want us to learn from as we move into the One Africa?
From my own personal experience and also from having read of other people's experiences, is that I think Africans want and love to explore our African continent. But I will tell you of a time when I had to travel to Mali, and I traveled to Mali twice, I think in a space of 2 weeks. So the first time I went and I had to travel from Cape Town to Joburg, and then from Joburg to Nairobi, and then a 7-hour layover, and then from Nairobi to Bamako. And the alternative option was Johannesburg, Addis, and then Addis to Bamako. And when I was now going for the second time, I asked for an alternative. And the alternative that I was given without a layover that was going to make my travel more efficient was that I fly to Paris and then connect from Paris to Bamako. I have to get out of the African continent and then come back onto the African continent if I want a more efficient and quicker travel. And I think I'm not the only one who's experienced this. So I think from a travel perspective, one of the things that I would love to see is the ease of travel, the ease of access of all the four corners of our beautiful continent. And because of what I've described, it actually then makes it pricier to travel to our fellow African neighbors. So I think that's one thing that I certainly think we need to change. The other thing is, I think we need to see more stories of Africa's glory. I think this whole thing of when we talk about travel, we have to talk about all other regions. So for you to say that you've traveled, you've been exposed, it means that you've gone to all other regions apart from Africa. And I'm always inspired by Tebe. I think he's done all countries and he's documented his travels on Instagram. And every time him and Tembi go to another country, I'm always inspired. So I actually do want to experience all 54 countries. But can the travel industry make it more accessible and make it easier to access all African countries?
You just spoke about Tebe. I was also looking at his Instagram, and he's a past guest, Tebe Ikalafeng. And yeah, it's quite interesting. There are very few people that have been to 54 African countries, and Tebe is really an inspiration. So thank you very much for sharing and mentioning that. Let's talk about Journey to Enough and Luminary. What can you share with us?
Yes, so I started Journey to Enough because in my coaching work and in my leadership development work, what I always see is there's a pedestal that we place people on when they are on stages because we believe they are more human than us, they've done more extraordinary things than us. But I want to say that they actually just have chosen to be brave and be seen, and that is why they're there. So often when I coach or when I facilitate, I also try and bring my human aspect so that people don't then put me on a pedestal. And in doing that, it's sharing with them subconsciously that you are enough. So for me, the journey is not to the person feeling whole, but it's to the embodiment of feeling whole, regardless of what life has thrown at you. So that is really the movement of journey to enough. It is the journey to the embodiment of your enoughness, because we have to start from the premise that we are all enough. So we're going to start having sit-down interviews with people from all walks of life who can reflect back our daily experiences of really celebrating our successes, owning our limitations, and really just pushing and allowing ourselves to be seen. So that's on the movement that I'm really passionate about. And then on Luminary, is the consulting practice that does strategic formulation. We do leadership development, we do culture transformation, we do organizational design, we do personal mastery, we do diversity and inclusion. And so we've had a privilege of working with leaders across industries and across regions, and we've learned enough for us to be able to facilitate higher levels of thinking in these organizations and elevate the level of discourse when it comes to really thinking about your strategy and leading your organizations.
Thank you for sharing. That takes us to your partnership with one of our sponsors, Optimum African Experience, where they will be bringing leaders from across the globe for what they're calling a Cape Town Leisure Experience, which is a 4-day trip. I believe you're one of the facilitators. And Cape Town, what a destination. It's mentioned in Robin Sharma's 5 a.m. Club as an inspirational environment. What can you tell us about your day of facilitation?
You know, one of the things that I found always amazes people is when I ask, have you ever had leadership development with horses as your facilitator? And people always look at me with this shocked look like, what do you mean? Yes, actual horses. Just last week, I worked with a group with an equine facilitator who I'll be working with for the Leisure Experience. And we designed a process where firstly, we start with them understanding who they are and what it is that they bring, because I always believe that as a leader, for you to be able to articulate your story, because stories inspire. Strategy plans don't inspire. Excel spreadsheets don't inspire, but stories inspire. So the ability to tell your story as a leader in a way that humanizes you, in a way that engages people to follow you, is a very powerful skill. So we do a bit of that. We also then help them look at what are the things that inform their story through mental models. And then we also introduce them to the concept of neuroscience, because one of the most powerful organs that we have as human beings that actually differentiates us from other species is our neocortex, our prefrontal cortex, which is the executive function part of our brain. But that executive function part of our brain is led by what we call the limbic system, which is the one that actually makes all the decisions. So we introduce them to how they can maximize or harness the power of their brain. And so with all this, we then introduce them to the concept of equine, which is finding or tapping into the authentic leadership in you through the eyes of horses. Why horses? Horses are prey animals. And also horses don't have what we have as humans that creates judgment. Horses only live in the present. So they will only reflect to you the energy that you present to them, which is the energy that you present to everyone every day. But everyone every day eggshells around you and is not able to then show you how your energy impacts them. But a horse has nothing to lose. It only lives in the present. And so it will give you back your energy unfiltered and in a way that carries no judgment. And so then you can process that. And what I've found is it gives leaders a breakthrough that they will carry for the rest of their lives. I still carry the breakthrough that I was given by a late horse called Camaro many years ago. And it has really impacted the way that I show up. So I think that gives you an insight into the work that we do in our Blazer facilitated process.
Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more from those experiences and learning from those that would have attended. What podcast or book can you recommend?
So my all-time favorite is The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. I believe that it just gives you a way of liberating yourself from the multiple scripts that we live by and from the scripts of that voice in your head that says many things. And if you're wondering which voice I'm talking about, it's that voice that is asking, what does she mean? Is that voice that I'm talking about.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can with Optimum African Experience Cape Town Pleasure Experience, with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
Africa is a continent full of potential, but potential means nothing if we don't take action to create value. Let us take action. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to post and share this episode on your social media platforms. It will help us reach our mission of sharing knowledge about intra-Africa trade and making it available to as many people as possible. Let us grow our continent. We can go far, fast, together. If you can please leave a review on our podcast page or on Apple Podcasts.